Good afternoon and evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the Stomach Health Workshop presented by myself, Heather Schofield. I'm the Education Director and Medical Advisor with Biomed, and I'm really excited to be talking about stomach health tonight. For stomach health in general, there's some things that are really important from an anatomical and then also from a physiological perspective. The stomach, in order to be very healthy, it does have a mucus lining that protects the stomach lining. And then you've got secretions that are really important, including pepsinogen and gastric lipase for protein and fat digestion. And these are one of the big aspects of the stomach is about protein digestion, and it's also about anti-parasites. So then we also have hydrochloric acid production, and normal hydrochloric acid production is really important for activating pepsin, which is an enzyme to digest protein, and also to chelate minerals or bind onto minerals and for their absorption. It helps to control bacteria and kill bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, so our stomach is a barrier as a protector for the body. And then normal hydrochloric acid production is also really important with iron absorption. And then finally, it produces and secretes intrinsic factor, which is vital for B12 absorption. So for the stomach, it's really important with protein digestion and also a lot of mineral and nutrient absorption, in addition to being that physical barrier against pathogens. Okay, so then the one thing we are going to be talking lots about is hydrochloric acid. There's two aspects of hydrochloric acid. You can have, well, hopefully we all have normal hydrochloric acid, but there in reality is a lot of low hydrochloric acid, and then there also could be high hydrochloric acid. We're going to talk about low hydrochloric acid because this tends to be more prevalent. And in the end, when you're treating from a biological medicine perspective, you always have very similar type treatments. And so the hazards of having low hydrochloric acid, the signs and symptoms include things like heartburn, acid reflux, burping after meals, indigestion, gas and bloating, and a really hard time digesting meat and protein, and then also leading potentially to protein deficiencies. So if the enzyme pepsin isn't turned on by hydrochloric acid, then you aren't going to be having the protein bonds cleaved into the amino acids, and so therefore it's harder for the body to absorb it. Then in addition, if the meat is also not chewed properly, then things aren't broken down, and so it can end up into the distal part of the colon and create things like protein putrefaction. Protein putrefaction then ends up secreting a lot of toxic chemicals, which then can lead to inflammation and has been linked to a lot of the chronic inflammatory bowel conditions, and it has even been linked to cancer. And so digesting protein and making sure it's digested well from the very beginning when we're chewing it to making sure there's enough hydrochloric acid to be able to support a proper pepsin. These are all things that are really important for overall digestion, but very specifically for protein digestion. Other things that can be as signs or symptoms for low hydrochloric acid include things like constipation or diarrhea, food sensitivities and allergies, chronic intestinal infections, SIBO, H. pylori, and as I already mentioned, the stomach does play a role as a barrier for parasites. And having proper levels of hydrochloric acid is really important because it's very acidic, so it can kill off a lot of bacteria. Other types of signs and symptoms include things like fatigue, mineral deficiencies, and so the minerals that are very linked to proper levels of hydrochloric acid include calcium, zinc, magnesium, copper, boron, and selenium. And then it's also important for iron and B12. When there's mineral deficiencies, then you can see things like down the road osteoporosis, dry and brittle hair and nails, if you come across patients that have white spots on their nails, there is kind of the idea that it's the lack of calcium, but truly it's actually a lack of zinc. And so the lack of zinc could be that the zinc's they're not getting enough zinc in their diet, that they're not absorbing the zinc very well due to intestinal inflammation, or they have low hydrochloric acid levels, so therefore the zinc isn't being chelated to be able to be absorbed properly. So if you're seeing white spots on your patient's nails or on your nails, make sure to be thinking about zinc, and not only think about zinc supplementation and intestinal inflammation, but also be thinking about hydrochloric acid levels in the stomach. And then iron deficiency, just to mention that, again, iron does need acid for absorption. And then also, if protein isn't being broken down and there's poor meat digestion, then also iron may not be absorbed. And then finally, B12, it needs intrinsic factor in order to be absorbed, and this is all part of the stomach acid. And so I just want to talk a little bit about anatomy, just so that we all have a good idea of what's actually happening within the stomach. And so the stomach has many layers, and so that top layer that's surrounding the lumen does include your epithelial cells, and then there's and this also makes up the big mucosal lining. And within that, in the lumen, you end up with parietal cells, mucus cells, gastric cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells, and they make up the lumen of the stomach, and these are the cells that end up secreting things like the pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid, and then the hydrochloric acid cleaves a bond off of pepsinogen to convert it to pepsin, which is the protein digester. Okay, so this chart is a great chart just to indicate what is actually being secreted within the gastric mucosa. And so the mucus cells, or the mucus neck cells, they secrete mucus and bicarbonate. So the mucus, of course, it's important because it's creating that physical barrier between the lumen and the epithelial cells. And then the other part is the bicarbonate. And so if you've heard us talk about sodium bicarbonate or potassium bicarbonate or acid-base balance, then you know bicarbonate is a really important, it's actually the key factor in all of this. And so it's also a key factor in stomach health. And this is going to lead us to talking about acid-base balance in a few minutes. So these mucosa neck cells also then secrete bicarbonate, and it creates a buffer as well within this mucus layer for preventing damage to the epithelial cells. Then we have the parietal cells, and the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and also the intrinsic factor. And so again, this is helping to activate pepsin from pepsinogen. It's helping to kill bacteria, and then allowing for B12 absorption to happen. Other types of things that you see is histamine, which is stimulating gastric acid, and then there's D cells and G cells, which are stimulating and inhibiting it. And then finally, you have these other cells called chief cells, and they're directly related to secreting pepsinogen and gastric lipase. So the pepsinogen, once it's coming in contact with the hydrochloric acid, then turns into pepsin to digest proteins, and then the gastric lipase is the first spot where fat is digested in the body. And then there's one more part here that I just wanted to show as a visual. Again, so I just talked about the parietal cells and the chief cells, and secreting pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid. When the pepsinogen does come in contact with the hydrochloric acid, then the bond is cleaved, it's turned into pepsin, and then it allows the smaller protein to be broken into smaller peptide fragments, and then finally into amino acids. In the parietal cell, the other things that are really important to understand is the parietal cell, and this is the cell that secretes hydrochloric acid. It uses a water and carbon monoxide, and when that binds, it ends up forming the raw material for bicarbonate. The bicarbonate then is pushed out into the blood and then circulated through the body, and then there's a hydrogen ion that's also secreted. Then the parietal cell also has potassium in it, and so it pushes the potassium out, which forces the hydrogen ions out, and it also pushes chloride out, and so then that's where you get your hydrochloric acid. So there is quite a bit of biochemical reactions that are happening within the parietal cells in order for hydrochloric acid to be formed. And it's all about chloride molecules and hydrogen molecules. And so the thing also to remember, though, is bicarbonate is a big component of this to be supplying raw material for hydrochloric acid to be produced. Okay. So now with all of that said, let's turn this into patient-friendly treatment terms about what we're actually supposed to do and use this information for. Okay, and so then just before we go there, let's talk about how to easily evaluate stomach acid with a baking soda test. Very simple test. It can be done in the office. It can be done at home. And you take a cup of cold water. Cold water is important. Half a teaspoon of baking soda and a timer. And then this test should be performed in the morning on an empty stomach before any eating or drinking has happened, and it should be done in consecutive days at the exact same time. So what you do is you mix the quarter teaspoon of baking soda into a cup of cold water, drink the solution, and start the timer. And then you want to record the first time when you burp or when your patient burps. And so this then will give you an indicator about how well their stomach acid is in the body. So if they're burping in less than a minute, so let's say 30 seconds, that's an indicator of high stomach acid, too high stomach acid. Burping between 1 to 2 minutes is indicating normal levels of stomach acid. Burping anywhere between 2 to 5 minutes is a low normal stomach acid indicator. And then finally, if you're burping after 5 minutes, low stomach acid and possible hypochlorhydria. And so, yeah, as I said, super easy test just to kind of get a gauge of what's going on if the stomach acid is within the normal range with the minutes for burping, or if it's too high or too low. Now, if it's too high or too low, what do you want to do about it? So now, going back to a few minutes ago when we were talking about bicarbonate, this is where acid balance comes into place, acid-base balance. And so I wanted to just talk about a little bit of my history as far as learning. And so when I first joined Biomed 14 years ago, I was able to study under some of the best biological medicine practitioners in the world and also in Canada. One of my mentors was Dr. Sandy Wood, and then another one of my mentors was Dr. Craig Wagstaff. And I remember when they were talking about acid-base balance, a lot of the time they were talking about digestion. I then was very fortunate to come across some books that were written by some masters of biological medicine that were typed up in the 80s, and again there was these articles that were talking about digestion using acid-base balance, not so much for acid-base balance properties but more for improving digestion. And so I was really curious to understand why there was all this talk about digestion when the idea was to use up hydrogen ions that are causing acidity within the body. And so the interesting part is that the bicarbonate, so sodium bicarbonate or potassium bicarbonate, that bicarbonate becomes a raw material. And that raw material is then used by the stomach to form hydrochloric acid. It's also used in the pancreas for forming enzymes and in the liver for forming bile. And so as you could see when we were looking at the diagram of the parietal cell, you do have that hydrochloric acid, you do have the bicarbonate component that's helping form the raw material to form hydrochloric acid. So acid-base balance, when you're using an alkalizer, that is actually improving and balancing out hydrochloric acid production. It will balance it out whether it's too high or too low. And so it's not so much so specific, but if the body is acidic or the acid-base balance or tissue acidosis or milieu acidosis is occurring, then you are going to get acid-like symptoms. And the acid symptoms, whether it's low hydrochloric acid or high hydrochloric acid, often feel still like acid, too much acid. So the acid base or the alkalizer remedy is really then used to get things rebalanced as far as producing hydrochloric acid. So an acidic terrain then, in general, can often result in acidic-like symptoms, so heartburn, acid reflux, low or high hydrochloric acid production. And so the goal with an acid-base balance remedy is, especially in stomach health, since that's what we're talking about tonight, is to supply the raw material, so through the bicarbonate, to bind to hydrochloric acid, which often is in excess, and then to help rebalance normal hydrochloric acid production. And then just, of course, as a side note, an acidic terrain is prone to inflammation, so it could be prone to gastritis. When the stomach ends up with H. pylori as a problem, then that's usually due to not enough hydrochloric acid in the stomach being produced. So again, more inflammation and then ulcers. Also, acidic terrain is prone to reactions like allergies, toxicity, and the list just goes on and on. Okay, so then you're probably wondering, well, how do you balance out hydrochloric acid levels? How do you reestablish these normal levels without using betadine hydrochloric acid or some sort of hydrochloric acid supplementation? Sometimes it's really important to supplement with hydrochloric acid, especially as you're working at the deeper underlying cause of what's going on. However, if you want to work at the deeper underlying cause, then this is when you would start to considering a protocol like this. It's actually pretty straightforward. And so with the hydrochloric acid levels, to reestablish them, you have to look at acid-base balance, and you have to look at some sort of digestive aid or bitter or something to be working within the stomach to help also balance out hydrochloric acid, and sometimes a digestive enzyme, not so much to balance out the hydrochloric acid levels, but to really help with the protein component of digestion while you're getting things better balanced out. So to reestablish the levels, we have 3 different alkalizers. We have basic tab, basic powder, or alkali powder. And all of them are acid-base balancers. They provide that raw material for hydrochloric acid production. They all contain a bicarbonate, and they then will help to improve hydrochloric acid production and then also support stomach mucus secretions. And so with the dosing, 2 tabs or 1 teaspoon of the powder twice daily, and it's really important to be taking it with on an empty stomach with warm water. And it often takes 1 to 3 months, but closer to 3 months really to get things rebalanced out. But of course, symptoms improving during that entire time. Then we've also got Absinthium, and Absinthium, it's a digestive aid, it's a bitter, and it's also a stomach support drainage remedy that helps improve hydrochloric acid production within the stomach. So whether it's too high or too low, it's really helping to support the parietal cells to be doing the kind of secretion it needs to with hydrochloric acid. And so Absinthium as a bitter or digestive aid, then 25 drops in warm water before meals for up to 3 months. It can also be used as an on-the-spot symptomatic relief as well. And then digestive enzyme, it is a high-potency digestive enzyme, and it has high amounts of protease in there to help support protein digestion. And then that's a capsule taken with every meal. And then finally, as part of a reestablishing component, and especially with the terrain, an acidic terrain, and from a biological perspective, a restoration diet is also recommended. And so this has got a big emphasis on alkaline foods, limited caffeine and alcohol and sugar, low animal protein, more vegetable and non-meat sourced proteins, all fruit and all raw vegetables need to be eaten before noon, and that is because our peak time for digestion is before 3 p.m., and so therefore you want to do all of the eating of the stuff that needs more digestion or more digestive powers before lunch, and then keeping the rest of the day lighter. And then for veggies, afternoon, they need to be cooked. And then also a restoration diet needs to include free from common allergens or specific allergens for a patient or client. Okay. And so then let's talk about some remedies, and then we will talk about some protocols. Because we've set this up as a workshop, then we're putting more emphasis on the practical component of talking about the stomach and stomach health. Okay, so now I have already talked about basic powder, basic tab, and alcala quite a bit, and so just a reminder again, they're all acid-base remedies. The key ingredients in them include sodium bicarbonate and potassium bicarbonate, and again, it's that bicarbonate that becomes that raw material specifically for the stomach to help produce hydrochloric acid. That's not, of course, the only thing that an alkalizer does, but since we're talking about stomach health, this is why it's really important when we're working on the stomach to be thinking about an alkalizer. The other part of why it's important with the stomach, as I've already mentioned, is that this is, aside from the mouth, where chewing is happening, and of course there is digestive processes that are starting, the stomach is where real digestion really starts. It is 100% vital for protein digestion, and again for the mineral and iron and B12, not digestion, but absorption in the sense of being chelated to be prepped for absorption happens. And so the stomach really has to be considered when we've got patients not only with digestive issues, but also with other types of chronic degenerative conditions. The other thing that's also important to be thinking about is not just necessarily our meat eater patients or patients who are drinking lots of caffeine and maybe they're drinking alcohol and they're eating lots of meat and heavy foods. We have to also think about the vegetarians and the vegans, because a lot of the time they're not always kind of working the hydrochloric acid muscles of the stomach as heavily as a heavy protein eater would. And again, mineral deficiencies due to low stomach acid can become a big problem as well. And patients with candida and dysbiosis and SIBO, those are all things that potentially are results of due to low stomach acid in the first place. So the stomach and making sure stomach acid is up and running is vitally important for all of our patients, but especially for anybody with any sort of digestive or candida or SIBO or kind of area. Okay. And so then Absinthium, which I've talked about already, it is a remedy from Germany, from the Nessman line, and it is a bitter, and so therefore it can be used as a digestive aid. So in two ways, essentially in Germany, when I had the opportunity to spend some time at Nessman a number of years ago, and when I was with the medical advisor and we were going out for lunch, before we went out for any meals, he was reaching in his car into the side pocket, and he was taking something and he was drinking it. And so I was like thinking to myself, what is he doing? So we asked him what he was doing, and it was Absinthium that he was taking as a digestive aid or as a bitter to prep for the food that he's going to eat for lunch or for dinner. And so that was my first real kind of visual exposure to Absinthium being used as a digestive aid. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have digestive or stomach issues, but just as a general support, the Absinthium can work. It also works beautifully in those cases of heartburn, acid reflux, stomach symptoms, getting hydrochloric acid produced well and normally within the stomach, because Absinthium does work on the parietal cells in the stomach to produce hydrochloric acid. So It helps to normalize digestive gastric juices. It influences motility within the stomach. It has anti-inflammatory properties, and it also is just improving blood circulation to the actual stomach as well. Okay, and so it can be used acutely or just as a general thing. So acutely would be heartburn symptoms or acid-like symptoms, and the dosing is 20 drops in water as needed. And then generally before meals, 15 to 25 drops is what people would normally take. All right. So then another stomach healer. So far we've talked about acid-base balance and helping to produce hydrochloric acid or promote it in balanced ways. Same with Absinthium. If we've got patients who have active stomach symptoms, then Gastro Ease is the formula for them. And so it reduces inflammation in the stomach. It helps with gastritis. It contains herbs, specifically mastic gum, which is an anti-inflammatory, and it's an anti-ulcer, anti-H. pylori herb. And then there's a number of other things that are healers of the stomach and healers of the mucous membranes. And so Gastro Ease is a beautiful H. pylori formula. And so mastic gum, if this is something you're not familiar with, essentially it's got bactericidal activity, or, you know, in kind of visual terms, it's almost like it pokes holes in the H. pylori, so the bacteria isn't able to survive. And so this is a H. pylori, gastritis, heartburn, peptic ulcer healer formula that we have. And dosing, it's 2 capsules 3 times a day before meals, 20 minutes before meals. And then, if you're not familiar with Polio Okuu, this is a parasite formula, and not so much like an anti-parasite herbal formula, but instead it's a bark from a tree, the Helicobacter tree from Africa, and it's used for food poisoning and traveler's diarrhea and inflammation and diarrhea due to food intolerances, or if you're sensitive, let's say to dairy, and you end up eating out in a restaurant, and while you thought the food had no dairy in it, you had an exposure and it was creating digestive inflammation or upset or diarrhea, you can use the Polio Okuu to get all of this stuff calmed down. So I mentioned already the food poisoning, traveler's diarrhea. It helps to heal the GI tract from infections. If you've overindulged, let's say at Christmas or at a summer barbecue and you've eaten stuff and now you're not feeling great, it's really helpful in those types of situations as well. Food intolerances, and kind of a general eliminate metabolic waste products in the body. So the dosing for Polio Okuu in an acute situation, so this is in a diarrhea or really upset stomach situation or upset GI tract system, 2 tablets or 5 drops, so whether you're using the tabs or the drops, every 30 minutes until symptoms improve. Generally, it takes 2 to 3 doses, and that clears everything out. As a general thing or as a preventative, it would be 2 tabs or 5 drops twice daily. And so if you've got patients or yourself that is traveling and you've got concerns of wanting to protect your GI tract from diarrhea, then you can use it prophylactically. You can also then use it symptomatically as well. And so I know from personal experience, this is something I always actually keep on hand at all times. But also when traveling, I personally also use it more symptomatically than prophylactically, unless there's a situation where I'm not so sure and it's a little bit sketchy. I travel to Mexico quite a bit, so I always make sure I have Okuu with me at that time. But then I've also heard from feedback from practitioners so many times over the years about groups going on these travel holidays, especially into South America or to India, and some of the group would be taking Okuu and some wouldn't, and the ones who took Okuu wouldn't end up getting sick or have diarrhea and the others would. And so, yeah, it's definitely something to really keep on your shelf as an emergency remedy and keep in your own personal first aid kit so that you always have it on hand. Dr. Thomas Rao, he says it's the responsibility of the mother to always have Okuu in her pocket for when the child gets sick. So he believes, again, it's like a really good first aid remedy. And then finally, just as a little anecdotal story with Okuu, it was originally used in folk medicine in Africa with food tasters for the king. And so with concerns of foods being poisoned, the tasters would be tasting the food before the king would end up getting the food, and they'd always have Okuu with them, well, the Okuu bark. And so if there was any food that was suspect or they ate something and they weren't feeling well, then they would take that, and essentially it would prevent them from getting food poisoning. And then the one last thing, this bark does have an affinity to E. coli and Salmonella. So there is some specific bacteria that it's very helpful for. So, okay. And, oh, sorry, a question has just come through. So can Polio Okuu used to prevent diverticulitis exacerbations? Maybe or maybe not. So it definitely could be helpful. A lot of the time with diverticulitis, something gets trapped in the diverticuli or in the little pockets, and then you get a flare-up of inflammation and maybe an infection. And so, but then there's also, they're hotbeds for bacteria. So Polio Okuu definitely could help ease out symptoms and even potentially be used as a preventative with symptoms as well. Okay, and just make sure there's no other questions here. Okay, so then also with Polio Okuu, what I'd have to do for label-wise is there's a question just asking about combinations with drugs. So I don't know the specific, if there's any contraindications or cautions and warnings. I'd have to look that up. But Maria, I'm more than happy to email that to you to let you know, or you can also look on the label, and it does talk about if there's any drug interactions. Okay, so digestive enzymes in general. And so we've got 3 digestive enzymes. We also have a systemic enzyme, and we have a new nattokinase. This is the first NPN nattokinase in the market since 2012, so we're super excited about that. However, that's a talk for another day. So digestive enzymes in general, and if you're looking specifically for protein digestion, then digestive of the 3 of them, it's the strongest, highest potency digestive enzyme that we have, and it has lots of protease in there to be able to help with digesting protein. Biozyme, it is the broad spectrum digestive enzyme, so it's helping with protein, with fat, and carbohydrates. And then finally you have Lipidzyme, which is very specific for fat digestion, and so for people who are having gallbladder issues, who've had their gallbladder removed, or in general aren't digesting fats very well, then Lipidzyme is the one for them. Also, if anybody is on a keto diet, then Lipidzyme, because a keto diet is very high fat diet, Lipidzyme could help breaking down the fat and having it absorbed better as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the emotional meaning of the stomach. Before we get there, though, there's a couple of questions that have come through, and so this is coming just back to vegetarians and hydrochloric acid. So when we think often about hydrochloric acid production or symptoms of low hydrochloric acid, there's a lot of thought about people who are eating heavy meats and it's not being digested, or lots of coffee and tea or alcohol. And not everybody's thinking about the vegetarians and the vegans having hydrochloric acid problems, or at least having hydrochloric acid problems that are causing problems, because vegetarians and vegans tend to be eating less protein overall. However, one of the other components of having low hydrochloric acid is that you're not getting minerals chelated properly for absorption, and you're maybe maybe the intrinsic factor for B12 isn't being produced as well as it could, and it's not creating as acidic environment as it could to help with pathogenic bacteria. So, and also zinc is a big part of it as well. And so for vegetarians and vegans, hydrochloric acid, one of the issues that can show up if they're not producing it well is mineral deficiencies. And so that's kind of the main point I was making when talking about vegetarians and hydrochloric acid. And then the other thing is, so as far as the HCl supplement, Biomed doesn't have an HCl supplement per se. A lot of the stuff that we do have and that we support is working at the deeper root cause. And so, again, going back to acid-base balance and using an alkalizer to support the raw material to produce hydrochloric acid is the biological medicine technique, plus using Absinthium, which is a bitter and a digestive aid, and also helping the parietal cells produce more hydrochloric acid. So that would be the combo to be working at the deeper underlying root issue of hydrochloric acid, getting it rebalanced and produced properly in the body, rather than just giving a straight supplement. Okay, so then let's start talking about the stomach and the emotional meanings. As you know, of course, also Biomed, we have the entire Rubimed line, and so that's addressing old unresolved emotional issues, and all the organs are definitely connected to emotional meanings within the body. So the stomach is not excluded from that, and so there's a few things. Fear, definitely there could be a nauseous component, or butterflies in the stomach. Love can also produce butterflies in the stomach. Depression, there is a link with swallowed anger, burnout, adrenal burnout, and depression, all being a big part of not expressing personal power. Stress, of course, is well known in ulcers and what's eating away at you, and heartburn, and then sadness, kind of that gut-wrenching experience that could be giving stomach cramps. And so those are a few things to be considering or thinking about just from the emotional perspective. And then from Louise Hay, the stomach, it's supposed to be holding nourishment and digesting ideas, but instead if there's stomach issues, then there could be dread, fear of the new, inability to assimilate the new. Gastritis can be related to prolonged uncertainty or feelings of doom, heartburn, fear, ulcers, belief that you're not good enough, what's eating away at you or who's eating away at you. And again, so just some different ideas to be thinking about with the stomach. If you're working with Rubimed, then of course the stomach is associated with chakra 3, and chakra 3 is very much about emotional digestion and personal power. Okay, so then there's a few stomach protocols, stomach health protocols we're going to talk about. So we did already talk about helping to establish hydrochloric acid production in the stomach. So we'll review that again quickly. And then the rest of the protocols we're going to concentrate on tonight are heartburn and acid reflux, H. pylori and peptic ulcers, food poisoning and traveler's diarrhea, indigestion that's related to overindulgence, and overeating. Okay, so just a quick refresher again, reestablishing normal HCl levels. This is a protocol for low or high stomach acid. You're using an alkalizer. It's going to improve HCl production. It's going to help support the stomach with creating mucus secretions to protect the epithelial cells. And it then provides the bicarbonate, which is part of providing hydrogen and chloride for producing the hydrochloric acid. So if you're using the basic tabs, it's 2 tabs twice daily. If you're using the basic powder, it's 1 teaspoon. If you're using the Alcala powder, it is about 1 teaspoon or half a scoop twice daily with warm water on an empty stomach. And so whenever you're using an alkalizer, those 2 parts are really important, warm water, empty stomach. And the reason is, number 1, you don't want to have food in your stomach when you're using an alkalizer because then it's going to interfere with digestion. The other thing is, if you remember back to the burp test, this kind of creates that scenario where you could end up burping, and because it's an alkalizer, it's going to be interfering with hydrochloric acid. So you definitely want to make sure it's on an empty stomach so it doesn't interfere with digestion. The warm water then will have it sitting in your stomach for a shorter period of time, so then it can get into the small intestine and then get absorbed, and then the bicarbonate can start to do what it needs to do. Absinthium, again, this is a digestive aid. It is a bitter, and it helps the parietal cells in the stomach produce more hydrochloric acid or get it producing in a balanced kind of way, and then also bringing more blood flow to the stomach tissue in general, so just to support the stomach. And then digestive potentially if there's a protein digestion problem, just because this digestive enzyme, again, is really high in protease. Okay, and so then heartburn and acid reflux. A lot of the time, the base of these protocols is having an alkalizer in there. So again, it's the same idea with using basic tab or basic powder or alkala, and for all these same reasons to help with hydrochloric acid production and getting that balanced. And then absinthium again with hydrochloric acid balance. And so a lot of the time, patients will have heartburn, and a lot of the time also the kind of allopathic approach is to be giving something like to quell down the hydrochloric acid. However, then now you've got really low stomach acid and really low hydrochloric acid, and now more potential for mineral deficiencies and all the other things that kind of go with it, less appropriate protein digestion. And so with those symptoms, a lot of the time when people are feeling like there's a lot of acid, it's really that it's low acid in the body's kind of kicking it up and creating more acid. So in many cases, it's a low stomach acid or low hydrochloric acid situation that feels like it's too much acid. And so in that case, that home test would be really appropriate to be able to figure out if it's low or high stomach acid. So. And then there's an off-label use with Luvose powder. If you mix it with some water, it can be used for symptomatic relief. They're large porous molecules. They soak up toxins. They soak up excess gas. And it does have an alkalizing effect without it being an alkalizer, so it can help with acid symptoms while the patients are working at the deeper underlying cause. Okay, so then let's move on to H. pylori. And with H. pylori, signs and symptoms of an H. pylori infection include things like pain, burning, or a gnawing sensation in the abdomen. The pain is often worse on an empty stomach, the loss of appetite, and then that also can relate with weight loss or unexplained weight loss, heartburn, frequent burping, nausea or bloating, sometimes blood in the stool. It would be dark blood like black digested blood, or bloody or black vomit, often that looks like coffee grounds. And so that type of vomit would be due to a bleed from an ulcer being in the stomach. And so the H. pylori, these are these wild-looking bacteria that make it through the mucous membrane into the through the mucous membrane into the epithelial cells, causing problems, causing ulcers to start. And so what to do? Gastro Ease. So I talked about Gastro Ease already, and it has got herbs that are healing ulcers, herbs that are healing the stomach lining, herbs that are helping to support mucus production, and then working as an anti H. pylori formula to kill the H. pylori, and then also helping as an anti-inflammatory to decrease inflammation overall. So it's a really lovely stomach healer. So whether that's a gastric ulcer and needing to heal the stomach from the ulcer, or if it's due to H. pylori, and a lot of the time those two things are connected, Gastro Ease is the one to consider. 2 capsules 20 minutes before meals, 3 times daily. And then the other thing to remember about H. pylori is it shows up when there is low hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And we all have H. pylori to some degree, but it's what the environment is saying. So if the stomach acid is low, it doesn't keep the H. pylori in check, and then all these symptoms and associated symptoms can arise. So this comes back to making sure we have proper hydrochloric acid production happening as well. And so basic powder, basic tab, or Alcala as your alkalizer, plus Absinthium are also part of this protocol. You've got your healer with the Gastro Ease, helping to kill the H. pylori, bringing down inflammation and healing the stomach, and then you've got the hydrochloric acid supporters as well. And then also the alkalizer plus Absinthium, they also tend to be anti-inflammatory. So that's a really nice kind of general protocol, not only dealing with the symptoms at hand, but helping to clear the underlying root cause as well. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about food poisoning and traveler's diarrhea. So this includes things like abdominal pain, diarrhea, fever, malaise, sweating, exhaustion, nausea, vomiting, and none of these things are pleasant. They're definitely not pleasant at home, and they're even worse when you're away traveling, not in your own home, in your own bed. So let's always have this as our option for preventing and or getting it under control very quickly. So Polio Okuu, again, this is working on that food poisoning, diarrhea, food intolerances. As I mentioned before, E. coli and Salmonella, it has an affinity for to help with that type of infection. And so acutely, every 30 minutes until symptoms resolve. In my experience, it's usually 3 doses, so about an hour and a half, and then things start to really improve. And then prophylactically, twice a day, or just kind of in general, also twice a day. The Lactobacillus sporogenes, this is also a species, it's Bacillium coagulans species as a probiotic, and it is very specific for diarrhea, or diarrhea after antibiotics, or diarrhea after exposure to food. And it also contains some FOS, so it's supporting healthy microbiota within the gut. So with the Lactobacillus sporogenes, it's 1 to 2 capsules twice daily. So in a diarrhea situation, then you'd want to be doing the 2 caps twice a day until the symptoms resolve. The other thing that's really interesting about this specific species is it's a right spinning species, so it has a really nice alkaline effect and secreting healthy L-positive lactic acid in the stomach, which has an alkaline and anti-inflammatory effect as well, which is one of the reasons why it's very helpful in diarrhea. And then finally, as an anti-parasite, we have a formula called Parasites. And so it's antimicrobial, it's antifungal, antibacterial, and it's an herbal formula. It can be used due to parasitic exposure and or diarrhea due to parasites. And so 2 capsules twice a day for that. Okay, and then let's see. Okay, so just before I start moving into indigestion, there's a couple of questions that have come up. And so talking about Pleosanivus with lactic acid. And so Pleosanivus, it's homochord, meaning that it's a multi-potency formula that is made from L-positive lactic acid. So L-positive lactic acid is a physiological lactic acid in the body. A D-negative lactic acid is classified as the pathogenic lactic acid in the body. And so if you are, or your patients are exercising hard and then they've got the sore muscles after exercise, that's an accumulation of the D-negative lactic acid. The other area where D-negative lactic acid accumulates is in the cells. And so the mitochondria, through respiration, if it's in an anaerobic, so a non-oxygen area, so the body and the cells aren't getting sufficient amounts of oxygen, cancer cells, this is part of their whole thing, is about not having high levels of oxygen. And so the mitochondria then, if they're in low oxygen, have to flip over to sugar fermentation as a means of respiration and energy production. And so when that happens, D-negative lactic acid is the thing that's secreted. So then the cells end up congested with this D-negative pathogenic lactic acid. And so this is all part of tissue, kind of that whole terrain milieu, acidosis, the connective tissue getting congested. And so Sanavis then is used to help flush the D-negative lactic acid out of the body, whether it's out of the cells or within the connective tissue or within the muscle. And it is an energy formula, it's a mitochondrial support formula, and then it's really great kind of symptomatically with associated with D-negative or pathogenic lactic acid. So that's essentially kind of what it's all about. And with the lactobacillus, when I was talking about that with the lactic acid, it secretes L-positive lactic acid, so it's creating a healthy scenario as well. If you want to learn more about this for the organic acids that we have, so Polio Sanavis and Polio Citro, then I love talking about it and I'd love to talk more about it, so please email me or give me a call here at Biomed. We also have webinars that are archived that talk a lot more detail about Sanavis and Citro, and so it's really kind of cool to be working on that more milieu terrain level to see. Okay, so we've got one more protocol here, and then we will be finished for our presentation tonight. Also, just to let everybody know, we will be sending out the slides. I'm going to be emailing them out tonight after the presentation, and I'll be emailing protocols and the webinar special as well. Okay, so just before we get to all of that, last protocol, indigestion, overindulgence, overeating. So you need a digestive enzyme in there to help break down all the things that have been overeaten, whether it is going out and pigging out on junk food, which for sure, sometimes it happens with all of us practitioners, but sometimes and more often than not happens with our patients. And then also, it doesn't even have to be junk food. It could be Christmas dinner. It could be going out with friends and having extra glass of wine. Whatever it is that ends up feeling like you've overeaten, you've overindulged, you have indigestion, or you just don't feel very great after, think again about a digestive enzyme to help get things digested better, and then Polio Okuu. It really works lovely and wonderful in those overindulgence, food intolerance kind of situations. And so symptomatically taking those 2 tabs at the time of symptoms, and then maybe a few more times to kind of get through and get the body better digesting and then feeling better as well. Okay, and so then with that, I thank everybody tonight for listening to our protocol workshop on stomach health. There was a question about ulcerative colitis. Now, ulcerative colitis as an inflammatory condition, it goes above and beyond what we're talking about today. Stomach health and focus on stomach health is really what I wanted to spend the day. So I'm more than happy to email a bigger protocol regarding ulcerative colitis. There's a lot more things in consideration, but I just wanted to recognize the fact that I did see that question come through. So for the Okuu dosing, for a lot of the protocols, anytime you end up working on the stomach and working on the digestive tract, it's all about how many days does it take the cells to turn over before you've got renewal. And so in a lot of ways, all of these protocols are anywhere between 1 to 3 months, depending on symptoms and depending on how a patient's feeling. Whenever you're doing an alkalizer, typically you need to do about 3 months. Absinthium, typically it's recommended when you're doing a drainage support formula to, again, do it for about 3 months. The nice thing is it's just a bottle a month for the 3 months, so it's not too much to take. When you're dealing with traveler's diarrhea and things like that, that's just a symptomatic thing, and so once things calm down, then you don't necessarily need to continue on, or maybe for a few days after that. And then the indigestion, if that's related to eating a specific meal, again, it's more kind of symptomatically. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. And with digestive enzymes and feeling worse afterwards, it would probably then, it would have to be whatever the formula is about, because different digestive enzymes, when you've got a digestive enzyme in general, a lot of the time there's a mix of a lot of different enzymes in there, and then sometimes you can have the betadine, hydrochloric acid in there, sometimes you've got ox bile or bile in there, sometimes there's herbs. So it really probably depends on what's happening with the formula. Also, what is the status of the hydrochloric acid in the stomach? What food have they been eating? And so, yeah, there's a lot of different considerations. I wish that there was a really easy answer to what's going on, but a lot of those things would have to be specifically clarified to what is in the formula, and then what have they eaten, and if it's worse afterwards, it's possible then it's high hydrochloric acid, and it needs to be dampened down a little bit. Sometimes it could be due to really low hydrochloric acid, and so that's really what the issue is. And the heartburn is flaring due to that, because then once you've eaten with digestive enzymes, sometimes the stomach will pump out more hydrochloric acid to compensate. And so, yeah, I wish I could answer it more specifically, but definitely there's considerations that would have to be answered first. Okay, and looks like there's a couple more questions here. Yes, I would be happy to send ulcerative colitis answer for you. I've noted down your email, so I've got that. Okay, so just the question is, Dr. Rao talks about fermentation solution for probiotics, and then how is it different from lactobacillus? So I would have to also look, because I'm not 100% sure. And also not 100% sure what the EM ferment solution is, unless there's Aveliza that he talks about, and then there's also another one that he talks about as well. So definitely the lactobacillus, it's not a fermented solution, it's a specific probiotic. And I know in those fermented solutions, it can be fermented from a variety of different things, and so then there can be a variety of species that potentially is in there. However, I don't know what the specific species is, and Lactobacillus sporogenes or Bacillus coagulans, it's just a single species. Yeah, so there's a little bit of general information there for you. Okay, and okay, one other question here. Is it common to see parasites come out while alkalizing? So parasites are interesting because, I mean, the definition of parasite is huge. You can have microscopic, bacterial, fungal, viral, parasitic infections. You can have different part of the microbiota, and then you can also have parasites that are more in kind of the worm category, like things like tapeworm and roundworm and hookworm and pinworms, and then you've got giardia, and so there's a lot of different things that happen with these different species. Also, they are very dependent on moon cycles and on cyclical cycles as well, and so it depends on what stage they're in, and if they're in an egg stage and if they're hatching. And when you're starting to clean up the gut and when you're alkalizing, you might start to kind of flare some of this stuff up. And so it's a possibility that parasites could start to be shifting and moving and be kind of more exposed for clearing out when you're doing any sort of gut protocol, and it's just part of the entire process. However, with that also said, alkalizing specifically does not bring parasites out afterwards. It could be just all part and parcel of. And so I'd be happy again to talk further about this with you if you have some more specific information. And parasites, like it does require, some other things, a lot of anti-parasitic type herbs, and supporting kind of the gut and the train to kind of not have it as a environment that would be really lovely for the parasites to continue to stay. And so parasites, the formula, it would be something with your alkalizing, if this is something that's happening with a patient or a client, to be adding the parasite formula into the mix. So if things are hatching or kind of, be coming to the surface, then you can clear them out. One thing I do know, Candida as a parasite or kind of pathogenic Candida, it can flare when you're doing certain things because Candida is great at going into hiding, and when it doesn't feel as threatened through fungals, whether they're herbal or whatever you may be doing, then it can flare up again. So, depending, there's all kinds of, again, reasons why things can flare up. And parasites in general, again, what parasite is it? And then I could give you more specifics. Okay, I think there's one more question in here. And, oh yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So once again, thank you so much for joining our protocol workshop on summer and summer health, and also for stomach health. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that I've been able to give some really great information that you can start to turn into protocols. If you have any questions about any of the stuff that I talked about tonight, feel free to respond back to the email that I send. And don't forget to take advantage of some of these really wonderful formulas like Absinthium and Gastro Ease and Okuu for popping them into protocols with your patients as you work on their stomach health. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night. Take care.